If Islam is again to play the role of leader of mankind, then it is necessary that the Muslim community be restored to its original form. In this episode of Philosophers Explain, we turn to Sayyid Qutb's 1964 publication, Milestones, written while Qutb had been in prison in Egypt in a couple of years before he is to be executed. And in the Milestones, the text to which we are about to turn, we find Qutb's call to the vanguard of the jihadi who are going to both restore and lead Islam into the next generation. Let's go to the text. In 1964, Sayyid Qutb is in prison in Egypt. He had been in prison for 10 years, since 1954, where he had been arrested and put in prison for conspiracy to assassinate the Egyptian president. He was released briefly in 1964 due to health concerns, but then there was another assassination attempt on the Egyptian president, and Qutb was wrapped up in the conspiracy and convicted of that, and then executed in 1966, whereupon he becomes, because of his many publications, not only a leading intellectual, but a martyr figure for politicized Islam, or Islamism, as it is often referred to. Now, Qutb had been born in Egypt. He received a very good classical education, not only in Egyptian and Arabic and Middle Eastern literature in general, but also European literature, philosophy, novels, the artistic world as well. In 1948, he had come to America, where he had pursued a master's degree, spending time in Colorado and in California. He was appalled by what he saw there, the loose sexual morals and the general decadence, as he saw it, of American society. Also in 1948, of course, the nation of Israel was founded, and again, Qutb was appalled. Upon his return to Egypt in 1954, he had joined by 1954 rather, he had joined the Muslim Brotherhood, which was religiously oriented, that everything political is downstream from religion and the correct religion is Islam. So he was also then, as part of the Muslim Brotherhood, as it was ideologically, opposed to the then regime in Egypt under Gamal Nasser, which was broadly nationalistic, broadly pan-Arab, ethnic-oriented, socialist in its economic and political philosophy, and secular, or trying to become more secular. So the Muslim Brotherhood and the Nasser regime were constantly opposed to each other. Assassination attempt in 1954, another one 10 years later in 1964. Qutb involved in some way, but nonetheless convicted in Egyptian courts and executed in 1966. The text that he had published, Milestones, the one we are turning our attention to 2 years earlier, then became a leading manifesto for Islamism, and not only its influence was effective in Egypt, more broadly in the Arab world, more broadly in the Muslim world, and redounding over the course of the next several decades. But let's go to the text. Mankind today is on the brink of a precipice. Well, why so? Well, because humanity is devoid of those vital values which are necessary not only for its healthy development, but also for its real progress. So this is a value-oriented. Ethics and values are at the heart of the mission here. All of society, all of culture, and then certainly all of politics must have the correct value framework. Now, where are we going to find these values? Well, we're not going to find them in the West. Western philosophy has become decadent and empty. The culture that has been based on that philosophy is materialistic, hedonistic, and decadent in all sorts of ways. And even the Westerners, according to Qutb in the 1960s, have recognized the value emptiness, even the value nihilism of the culture that they have created. Now, from the text. Even the Western world realizes that Western civilization is unable to present any healthy values for the guidance of mankind. Well, what has gone on in the West? Why not the Enlightenment? Why not science? Why not democratic republicanism? Why not liberalism and so forth? All of those are failures, and the manifestation of them can be seen certainly in the politics, which brings the worst not only out in the people who are voting, but the worst out in the politicians. And the Westerners recognize it. The West is supposed to be originally about some sort of economically liberal, free market, perhaps capitalist type of economic system, but that too is a failure. Evidence, Qutb writes. Democracy in the West has become infertile to such an extent that it is borrowing from the systems of the Eastern Bloc, especially in the economic system under the name of socialism. So on Qutb's analysis, by the time we get to the 1960s, the Western capitalists have realized that they do not have a vital, healthy system, so they are turning to socialism. He does have in mind moves like the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, increasing regulations during the 1940s, 1950s in the post-World War II period. Then by the time we get into the early 1960s, this is still the transition to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, as it was called, and further encroachments of government or introduction of government into the economy. So all of these ideas, now they are not outright socialism, but they are creeping socialism, and Qutb takes them to be an indication of the West realizing its bankruptcy and borrowing from socialism, which of course had been developed in the eastern parts of Europe. But what about this socialism? Well, even socialism is itself a disaster and a failure. But now Marxism is defeated on the plane of thought. By the time we get to the 1960s, the old left has died, and now there's a new left that's going off in a number of different directions, but all of those different directions recognizing that classical Marxism has failed. It's defeated on the plane of thought. We need to go off and do various other things. And the only place where we find Marxism prospering are in places that were already societies that had been steeped in dictatorship for a long time. They already had a debased, cowardly kind of populace, and so that's where Marxism is only flourishing in practice. So, as Qutb puts it, this ideology prospers only in a degenerate society, or in a society which has become cowed as a result of some form of prolonged dictatorship. So Russia perhaps is the leading nation. We might then say China, but China, if we think about its history and the peasantry and what kind of people it had created, the same thing in Russia under the czars for generations, and now the Bolsheviks come along and they have a communist revolution and they put in place practical Marxism there, and it's sort of limping along maybe, right, but it can only work in those kinds of society. And so he names explicitly here Russia. And it's not only that it requires a certain kind of populace to put up with it, but it is itself a practical failure. Russia, which is the leader of the communist countries, is itself suffering from shortages of food, even worse than the occasional famines and struggles under the czarist regime the centuries earlier. So the West is not going to be the source, neither the democratic and capitalist nations nor the socialist communist nations as well. Instead, as Qutb puts it, it is essential for mankind to have new leadership. And where are we going to get this new leadership from? There's only one place where we can get it: Islam. Islam is the only system which possesses these values and this way of life. So if Islam is again to play the role of leader of mankind, then it is necessary that the Muslim community be restored to its original form. So we need to, in effect, go back to pre-modern times. No modernism. This is not yet postmodernism, but postmodernism is also reacting against what it sees to be the failures of the modern West as well. But nonetheless, we are going to go back to original Islam. So where do we begin? How do we get this project off the ground? How is it possible to start the task of reviving Islam? It is necessary that there be a vanguard. It's not initially going to be a mass movement. Instead, there had been the language in communist Marxism that we need a vanguard of the proletariat. The masses themselves aren't necessarily anymore, by the time we get into the 20th century, seeming to be particularly revolution. Instead, Lenin, Mao, and the others had said there needs to be a vanguard of a special elite of people who know what needs to be done and who will then take the whole movement. So Qutb is drawing on that analogy and applying it to the Islamic world. Islam as a whole is in a defeated, dispirited state. We need a new vanguard, a special elite of Islamic ideologues and warriors to revitalize Islam. It is necessary that there should be a vanguard which sets out with this determination and then keeps walking on the path, marching through the vast ocean of jahiliyya, which has encompassed the entire world. Now, this jahiliyya is to say anything that is not Islam, anything that is heretical, inappropriate forms of religion or non-religions, the various agnostic and atheist worldviews, secular worldviews that are out there. All of that is wrong. All of that is a source of corruption. That is jahiliyya, and all of that has taken over the world. Islam has to set itself against that. I have written milestones for this vanguard, which I consider to be a waiting reality about to be materialized. So, where do we start? Well, we start with the appropriate text. We start with the Quran, and we have the Quran. The Quran is the word of God, the word of Allah. And so we start there and see what it teaches us and put that into practice. The Quran of this message is still in our hands. So we have the books, we have the truths, we have all of the knowledge that we need. Read it, take it to heart, put it into practice. An important point, this message is a universal message. It's meant to be for all of mankind. God would not have made Islam a universal message, and he did make it a universal message. So it's not the case that there is a particular chosen people and that the message of God is only for those people and other people can do their own thing, whatever it is that they want. It's also not the case that there are alternative messages that are truer or just as true. And so it's not going to be a live and let live doctrine. Instead, this is the one truth that is meant for all of humankind, and it's necessary to take it to all of humankind. The spring from which the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, drank was the Quran, only the Quran. So we go back to the Quran, only the Quran. All of the important points are in the Quran, and we read only the Quran. No mixing and matching with other doctrines and so forth. And it has to be the original Quran. All of the later interpretive things that are going on, even in the Muslim tradition, are also to be treated with some level of respect. So there was something special about the generation of Muhammad, the original generation. There's another basic cause which has operated in creating this difference. That difference is in the method of learning of this unique generation. So there is a content to Islam that is found in the Quran, but there's also a method that is built into Islam that is also taught in the Quran. What is this method? They of the first generation did not approach the Quran for the purpose of acquiring culture and information, nor for the purpose of taste or enjoyment. None of them came to the Quran to increase his sum total of knowledge for the sake of knowledge itself, or to solve some scientific or legal problem, or to remove some defect in his understanding. So that then is to say the Quran's message is not primarily about knowledge. This is not an intellectual exercise. It is not a cognitive apparatus, and certainly it's not an aesthetic apparatus that we read it for pleasure and enjoyment. It's not about pleasure, it's not about aesthetic, it's also not about knowledge. Instead, what is it about? He, that is to say, the member of the original generation reading the Quran, approached it to act on what he heard immediately, as a soldier on the battlefield reads today's bulletin so that he may know what is to be done. The Quran has the truth. You believe it, and then the point is you act on it. You don't question it, you don't think about it, you don't compare it with other traditions. It is a body of knowledge that is absorbed, and then you take that as a set of action orders. And also notice the military metaphor that we immediately introduced. We are going into battle. And it is an action battle. Now, this then is going to mean that when we are engaging with people who are not followers, we're not going to be engaging with them at the intellectual level, engaging in discussions and debates and so forth. It is action, it is battle. A third cause is also operative in the history of the Muslims. We ought to look at that. When a person embraced Islam during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he would immediately cut himself off from jahiliyya. So that then is to say, we as the vanguard, or if we are going to be following in the steps of the first generation, Muhammad and his followers, we cannot see ourselves as part of the surrounding corrupt, decadent society. So all of its elements, its culture, its social practices, its laws, its general political systems, its religion, its mores, its history, all of that, we cut ourselves off from it in order to focus only on Islam and the true message that we are acting upon. Inside this jahili society, where we recognize that we are alien, in many cases we are minority, and nonetheless we are in an adversarial relationship with it. But we have to put up with that adversarialism. The Muslim encountered nothing but burdensome except the torture and oppression, but he had already decided in the depths of his heart that he would face it with equanimity. And hence no pressure from the jahili society would have any effect on his continuing steadfast. I am going to strive to not only cut myself off, but any inducements, any enticements, any pressure, even to the point of torture and oppression that jahili society, visits upon me, is not going to shake my faith, shake my commitment to the cause. We must free ourselves from the clutches of jahili society, jahili concepts, jahili traditions, and jahili leadership. Our mission is not to compromise with the practices of jahili society. Pausing there, no compromise whatsoever with non-Muslim society. Nor can we be loyal to it. So even if we are in a nation where the legal system, the political system, is not a Muslim system based on the Quran. It's one of the capitalist systems, or it's a democratic Republican system, or it's this, that, or the other. We are not loyal to it and its laws and its practices. We are loyal to Islam and its laws. Its jahili characteristics, it is not worthy to be compromised with. Our aim is to change the jahili system at its very roots. So we are radical, and radical means going to the very roots. We want to go to the very roots of jahili society and change them. We are radical revolutionaries. This system, which is fundamentally at variance with Islam, and which, with the help of force and oppression, is keeping us from living the sort of life which is demanded by our Creator. Suggestion here is, as long as there is jahili society and it is powerful, it prevents us from being true Muslims, from following Islam as it ought to be. We are therefore victims and oppressed by the mere existence and the powerful current existence of jahili society. All right, now the nature of this religion, how all-encompassing is it? It's not only that it is true and it is the only truth and that it is the only truth for all of humankind, but it is also comprehensive and speaks to every aspect of life. Its system extends into all aspects of life. It discusses all minor or major affairs of mankind. It orders man's life not only in this world, but also in the world to come. So it is a total. So it's not the case that Islam gives you some general principles and it's up to us to work out how they apply in more applied minor details. Instead, it is very specific right down to the level of minor details, and we follow it and only it. And the first thing is that we have to then recognize it and submit ourselves to the total package. Indeed, the spirit of submission is the first requirement of the faith. So it's a faith because it's not, so to speak, primarily a cognitive, rational, argued for evidence and logic doctrine that we talk ourselves into. It is presented to us, we accept it by an act of faith, and then that requires that as a consequence of that faith, we are submitting ourselves in action to acting according to the faith. As soon as the command is given, the heads are bound. Act of submission right from the beginning. Now, all of these principles, all of these laws, all of these mores that we are to follow, both major and minor, that is the doctrine of Sharia law. Their practical life had not taken a permanent form, so they could have organized themselves according to the divine law, al-Sharia. So there is the development of the divine law. It is God's law meant to govern our thinking and behaving here on earth. That is collectively called al-Sharia or Sharia law. It is not merely a religious doctrine. We're not going to buy into Western notions of separation of religion from politics or church and state or mosque and state as we would adapt it here. Instead, the power of the state, the power of law, religious law needs to be politically instantiated. The power of the state was behind its enforcement. Thus, the constructing of the faith should be long and it should be gradual. First, it should be implanted in the hearts of men. It should materialize in the dynamic social system whose external and internal growth reflects the evolution of the belief. Again, first, notice the metaphor that's used here. It's implanted in your heart. It's not first in your head. It's a faith commitment and a submission commitment that one makes. It's not something that one argues oneself into by means of data and logic. And he emphasizes this point, Qutb. It is an error, and what an error, to think that Islam can evolve in the form of an abstract theory limited to intellectual learning and cultural knowledge. Beware of this danger. Beware. Islam is not an intellectual force. It is not abstract theory. It is a doctrine to which one makes a faith commitment and a total submission and action obediently commitment. Moving on, the purpose of Islam, right? And here he's giving an explanation for why it's called Islam, which means to bring human beings into submission to God, to free them from servitude to other human beings so that they may devote themselves to the one true God, to deliver them from the clutches of human lordship and man-made laws, value systems and traditions, so that they will acknowledge the sovereignty and authority of the one true God and follow his law in all spheres of life. Again, submission, right, to divine law, rejection of any man-made laws, and it is all-encompassing in one's life. And it's not just for me as an individual, it is society-wide, it is humankind-wide. The Muslim society cannot come into existence without this. It cannot come into existence simply as the creed in the hearts of individual Muslims, however numerous they may be, unless they become an active, harmonious, and cooperative group, distinct by itself, whose different elements, like the limbs of a human body, working together for its formation, working under a leadership which is independent of the jahili leadership. Now, unpacking that someone. This religion, this doctrine is not a matter of one having an individual relationship to God, or one individually deciding what the value framework and what the meaning of one's life is. Instead, one, of course, is an individual, but primarily one is a part of a group of believers who have the same belief system, the same values, the same goals. And that group is under the leadership of a vanguard, an elite who are taking them in the one true direction, and that vanguard taking them in the one true direction is a different direction from the leadership, the political and cultural leadership in the non-Muslim societies. So we have an explicit suggestion here of what is sometimes called the organic theory of society. So it's not the case that we should understand society simply as a collection of individuals with kind of overlapping interests and agreements, and then those individuals form and unform various social relationships. Rather, the primary unit is the society, conceived of, at least in strong analogy, as an organism. The individual is like a cell in a body, has a function to serve only for the body as a whole. In this respect, the service rendered by Islam's pure way of life has produced concrete and valuable results. Islam based the Islamic society on the association of belief alone instead of the low associations based on race and color, language and country, regional and national interests. That then is to say, as a social and political doctrine, we are pushing for the integration of a kind of theology or a religious doctrine in all aspects of life, but it is the religion that is fundamental. And that speaks to all human beings. That then is to say, any racial divide of human beings into black, white, brown, yellow, red, and so forth, that is irrelevant, or at best secondary or tertiary. We are not primarily racial. Also, we are not primarily ethnic. It's not a matter of language and country, right, and or my region, right? So we are not ethnically focused. Instead, it is meant to be a message for all ethnicities. So all of the narrower political and cultural doctrines that try to identify the proper ethnicity, the proper cultural group, and build everything around that, that also is wrong. And also we are rejecting nationalism. So it's not Egyptian, right? It's also then not going to be Arab. It's also not going to be, say, for brown people primarily. Instead, it's for all people, transcending nationalism, transcending ethnocentrism, transcending racism. Now we introduce explicitly the concept of jihad. What do we mean by jihad? We've had a military metaphor of going into battle against an alien force that is oppressing you, that you need to distance yourself from, but at the same time fight and hopefully cause to submit to the one true message. What is this going to take? Well, what does one do as one embarks on one's jihad journey? Well, first, of course, you read the Quran, right? And then one recognizes that one should preach, right, and or fight and or restrain yourself from those who don't make war with you. This is in the early stages of it. So we read the Quran, right? We are preparing, after having done that, to go out and preach, right? Of course, in the first generation, there is going to be a certain amount of fighting against some groups, and then nonetheless, there are other groups that we are going to restrain, at least for the time being, from fighting. Later, he was commanded to fight the polytheists until God's religion was fully established. So we're going to go through the history of Islam as an activist movement. There's a strategy, or at least there are stages, from initially a small group of people until it's going to become worldwide. After the command for jihad came, the non-believers then were divided into three categories. All right, so these are the three categories we need to identify, and then there's going to be a different sub-strategy for each of those categories. One, with whom there was peace. Two, the people with whom the Muslims were at war. and 3, the dhimmis. So let's go through each of these groups. It was also explained that war should be declared against those from among the people of the book who declared open enmity until they agreed to pay jizya or accept Islam. Now, the people of the book, these are the Jews and these are the Christians. So what we have then is places where Islam is predominant, say, and there will then be some non-Muslim minorities within that group. They are the dhimmis within the group. But there are also in the broader region places where the Christians and the Jews are perhaps more predominant. And then there are other areas further outlying in many cases where there are people with whom the Muslims are currently at peace. So these are the 3 groups that we are attending to. Now, first we turn our attention to the Jews and the Christians. We are in open opposition to them, and they are in open opposition to us. We have to go and fight them until we either get them to accept Islam, or at least in the temporary stage, they're going to pay jizya, which is a kind of tribute or a kind of tax. Concerning the polytheists, now moving along, and the hypocrites, it was commanded in this chapter that jihad be declared against them and that they be treated harshly. So we have to eliminate the polytheists or get them to convert to Islam. So this then is to say, as part of the universal message, our job is to spread it universally. And if we are going to do so, it can't simply just be waiting around. We have to go on the offensive. And so here explicitly, Qutb goes on to say, Islam is not a defensive movement. So it's not the case that we have our religion and we're just trying to protect our ability to practice our religion as we see fit. Just leave us alone and everything will be fine. No, it's much stronger than this. Instead, we can, of course, play around with the word defensive, but it's a more strategic understanding then of what defensive is. When we take this broad meaning of the word defensive, we understand the true character of Islam, and that it is a universal proclamation of the freedom of man from the servitude to other men, the establishment of the sovereignty of God and his lordship throughout the world. So we have to defend all of human beings against all of those people who are currently ruling people and making people do what they don't truly need and want to do, which is to be a part of Islam. The end of man's arrogance and selfishness and the implementation of the divine Sharia in human affairs. So we can either say that Muslims need to go on the attack and just simply take over the other religions and non-religions of the world and make universal Islam. And that then is to say, okay, fine, we are saying that we are an offensive attacking movement. Or what we can say is that properly all of human beings belong to God, but currently they have been attacked and taken over. And so what we are properly doing is defending the rest of the world from those who have improperly attacked them in the first place. But there's another thing that needs to be emphasized, this initial acceptance, obedience stage before one goes into jihad. Before a Muslim steps into the battlefield, he has already fought a great battle within himself against Satan, against his own desires and ambitions, his personal interests and inclinations, the interests of his family and nation, against which is not from Islam, against every obstacle which comes into the way of worshiping God and the implementation of the divine authority on earth. So any form of self-interest, any form of egoism, any form of thinking it's about me, my goals, my dreams, all of that has to be eliminated. Instead, a Muslim needs to be a kind of selfless person, as Westerners are increasingly calling it, a kind of altruistic person. I am selflessly sacrificing myself for the great other. In this case, the great other is God. I serve the other, not myself. And this is a great battle that every individual Muslim needs to overcome. It is the very nature of Islam to take initiative for freeing the human beings throughout the earth from servitude to anyone other than God. Other societies do not give it any opportunity to organize its followers according to its own method, and hence it is the duty of Islam to annihilate all such systems. Now, in many cases, Western societies, say, okay, come on, let's let individuals do their own thing. Let's separate church and state. Let's let people do what they want with respect to religion. And of course, we are fine with Muslims practicing Islam in their own community, setting up mosques and so on. We're going to allow you as part of our liberalism, and if we happen to disagree, we're going to tolerate nonetheless as part of our liberalism. But this still is an oppression according to Qutb's version of Islamism, because its method is not simply being tolerated as one religion among method. The true Islamic method is universalistic, and we are not able to be truly Islamic until everybody is following Islam. So we then have to annihilate all non-Islamic systems. Milestones is a relatively short book. By the time we get to the end, we have the call to martyrdom and recognition that for many in the vanguard of this movement, their end result for them as individuals is going to be a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, and in many cases, outright martyrdom, being killed for the cause by the enemy. How should one prepare oneself for this jihadi cause and the possible and even likely martyrdom that it will lead one to? But the faith in the hearts of the believers raised them above all persecution. Belief triumphed over life. The threat of torture did not shake them. They never recanted, and they burned in the fire until death. So we start off with all of the examples of martyred jihadis in the past. Take inspiration from them. Indeed, their hearts were liberated from the worship of this life. Islam is not about this life in the natural world, the physical world, the bodily world. It is not about achieving happiness or pleasure or contentment or self-realization in this life. We should not be worshiping this life. Instead, the true Muslim will, as we learn from the example of the preceding jihadis, they freed themselves from this earth and all its attractions, triumphing over life through a sublime faith. So life is a matter of eating and drinking and friendship and pursuing a career and making wealth and travel and friends and family and all of these sorts of things. All of that is this worldly, this life. These are all temptations that are put before an individual to lead that individual away from the true faith. The true faith points beyond this life, points beyond the entirety of this world. We have to triumph over life. That is what sublime faith requires. The same incident, that is to say, the resisting torture even to the point of martyrdom, also shows the height to which the spirit of a believer can soar, liberated and free, that height, the attainment of which has been the highest honor in all generations and in all periods. So the highest thing that is possible is to achieve this martyrdom. By earthly reckoning, though, tyranny triumphed over faith. So the martyr, of course, is killed. And from the earthly perspective, it seems like then the faith was defeated and the tyranny, those anti-Islam forces who are really tyrants have succeeded. But that's not the right way to look at it. Thus, from the earthly point of view, the end was pitiful anymore and tragic. But this is not the right perspective to take. From the earthly point of view, this tragic end troubles the heart. But the Quran teaches believers something else. It reveals to them another reality, shows them another scale with which to weigh all matters. We do not weigh triumph and success, the pursuit of values, on an earthly scale. We weigh it on a religious scale, an otherworldly, higher scale. Life's pleasures and pains on this scale, achievements and frustrations, do not have any great weight in the scale and do not determine the profit or loss. So it's not about material wealth, it's not about your family, it's not about your friendship, it's not about how much of the world you have traveled, it's not about your accomplishments in your career, it is about achieving Islam. That is the proper scale. In the scale of God, the true weight is the weight of faith. The weight of faith. And of course, you're going to die, but how are you going to die? That is the key. Are you going to die according to the lights of naturalistically earth-oriented worldly philosophy, or according to true higher religious philosophy, which Islam captures? All men die, and of various causes, but not all gain such victory, nor reach such heights, nor taste such freedom, nor soar to such limits of the horizon. It is God's choosing and honoring a group of people who share death with the rest of mankind, but who are singled out from other people for honor. The highest honor one can hope to achieve is martyrdom for the cause in the great battle against jahili society. Now, this is a very hard pill. It's one thing to say, well, I'm going to, give up my career, right? To give up being, say, an artist and create beautiful landscapes, or give up being a scientist and acquire new knowledge, and give up money and sex and pleasure and all of those sorts of things. Fine, but I can't wrap my mind around my children. And as a parent, as a father, or as a mother, I bring new life into the world. What am I supposed to think about the possibility of training my child for martyrdom, or engaging in some sort of act where I know the consequence is going to be that not only I die, but say my child or children are going to die as well? So Qutb singles out this issue for special attention. The messenger of God, peace be upon him, said, "When a certain person's child dies, God asks the angels, 'Did you take away the soul of my servant's child?' They say, 'Yes.' Then he says, 'Did you take away the apple of his eye?' They say, 'Yes.' Then he says, 'What did my servant say?' They say, 'He praised you.'" So the right attitude for a Muslim, and if you are a true Muslim, you have submitted to the faith and embarked upon the cause and are willing to accept all of the pain and suffering that goes this. When your child dies, if your child dies as a result of the cause, you thank God for that. That's the proper attitude. It is life from God for the martyrs. What happens to the martyrs? Do not consider those as dead who were killed in the way of God. They are living and find sustenance from their sustainer. So they have gone to a better world, a higher world. They are with God and are being sustained by God. They have transcended beautifully, wonderfully, nobly the earth and all of its immoral distractions. As to rejectors of the faith, what's going to happen to them, the tyrants and the criminals, God has repeatedly promised that he will catch them in the hereafter. So it might seem in many cases that jahili society has succeeded, and lots of people are living the good life. They have great sex lives, lots of money, happy families, they're traveling the world and so forth, and then they die comfortably in their beds. God will get them in the hereafter. And what will happen to them? Then their abode is hell. The martyrs go to heaven. Everyone else, at least anyone else who has not accepted Islam, is going to end up in hell. The Quran was creating hearts worthy of bearing the trust of being God's representatives on earth. And that means being willing to traverse the path of life until death in poverty, difficulty, frustration, torment, and sacrifice. This is the life Islam holds out for its true believers. They were not to seek any hasty reward on this earth. Then they will not be anxious if they have true faith while traversing this road ever paved with skulls and limbs and blood and sweat, to find help and victory, or desirous that the decisions between truth and falsehood be made on this earth. No matter how many skulls one needs to crush, how many limbs one needs to sever, how much blood one needs to spill, how much sweat, and including yourself, that happens to you, no matter what, you will not be troubled in your heart. You will not be anxious. You will remain true, steadfast, and follow the road before you. Indeed, this world is not a place of reward. So this, at the end of Milestones, then, is a description of the cause, the belief system, and the action that is required. Fundamentally, it is a religious battle that we are engaged in. This was not a political or an economic or a racial struggle. Instead, essentially, it was a struggle between beliefs, either unbelief or faith, either jahiliyya or Islam. Make one's choice. Now, Qutb was in jail when Milestones was published in 1964. 2 years later, in 1966, he was executed by the Egyptian government, again having been involved in a plot to assassinate the president. At that point, his writings are well known and are going to become even more well known, the cachet added to his martyrdom. A couple of interesting routes that were followed after Qutb's death in 1966. One is that his brother, Muhammad Qutb, left Egypt, went to Saudi Arabia, and became a professor at a leading university in Saudi Arabia. And within the next decade, one of his most famous to-be students was Osama bin Laden, who would then go on to found Al-Qaeda, and then Al-Qaeda, of course, responsible for the 9/11 attacks in New York City. Another interesting follow-up tangent is going to be that Qutb's fame upon his death and martyrdom and his writings made its way also all the way over to Iran, where a young Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was a leading intellectual, theologian, activist organizing Islam against the Shah then in Iran, supervised and had translated into Persian Qutb's writings. And so Qutb's writings then had many ears, many readers, many followers, including in some measure the Ayatollah Khomeini himself, who, as a result of the 1979 revolution in Iran, became the leader of Iran and was in a position to put into place a theocratic regime where Sharia law, Islamic doctrine is put into place and now has the power of the state behind it for its enforcement.